put my gardenia bushes out on the deck today. Thought, hey, the sunlight will do them good. And it's only going down in the 40s tonight, so they get sunlight all day today and sunlight all day tomorrow. I got to bring them in tomorrow before the sun goes down. But
And your luck.
all righty. Well, welcome once again to the Francis Schaeffer Study Center monthly historical lectures. This month's lecture, February 2026, is on Frederick the Wise. And it's a name that I think a lot of people have heard or know because he's so closely associated with Martin Luther. But as I discovered, what we know, if you've only read Luther and been interested in the Reformation, is you kind of know him as Luther's protector, Luther's patron, Luther's backer. Turns out his life is a lot more complicated and I think actually interesting than the little snippets that we get when he just shows up in the Luther story. To kind of understand why he shows up in the Luther story, you have to get a lot more information. And very few people have done it. There have really only been 2 biographies of him in the last 100 years. One in the 80s and one in 2015. So I'll talk about both of those. But as I was researching this, it gave me a whole different picture, and I'll talk a bit more about that because I had some fun with the discoveries. And of course, I got these 3 portraits of him at 33, 52, and 62 by Dürer and by Cranach, the 2 on the right. So, and here's a bronze bust done of him by an Italian artist, Adrian the Florentine, Adriano Fiorentino, which is just Adrian from Florence. But it apparently was done from life and gives a slightly different view of him, I think, a different picture of him from even the portraits. And I did not even know the existence of this until I went poking around with Google and Grok and said, what do you got? So once again, this is sponsored by the Francis Schaeffer Study Center, which was founded in 2004, and our mission is to promote a biblical worldview through the study of history, literature, and art. It is named for the influential theologian and apologist Francis Schaeffer. And I'm still of that generation who thinks 1980 was 20 years ago. I saw a meme on that last week. It says, there are a lot of people walking around who think 1980 was 20 years ago. Please don't try and explain it to them. You will only upset them. And yeah, it's hard to believe we're a quarter of the way through this century now, and I was still kind of living in my head very close to the old one. Anyway, we've been doing this for 22 years now. In addition to sponsoring this lecture series, we offer a high school program built around an integrated chronological study of Western civilization. In addition to that, we offer courses in academic writing. We offer a full sequence of high school science courses. And we occasionally have done some drama productions right here on this very stage. It's been a lot of fun. That's me. I will not need to update that first line until August, but yeah, sometime this year it's going to tick over from 48 to 49. My wife and I have 12 children, 3 sons, 9 daughters, 22 grandchildren so far. And my undergraduate degree is from Davidson College in North Carolina. I have a master's from Stanford University out on the left coast, where Cindy and I both felt like we were international exchange students. I'm trained as a historian, and I have taught history. I have read a lot of history. I have written about history. I do have a couple of books out, collections of biographies. And I've done a few other things along the way. And with my wife, I am the co-director of the Francis Schaeffer Study Center. Okay, you know what's coming next. What's something you already know about Frederick the Wise?
He knew a good thing when he saw it.
He protected Luther. That's a big thing. Without him, Luther might have gone the way of heretics in previous centuries. He might have been arrested and executed. And Frederick's the one who prevented that from happening.
And he was certainly not a timid individual.
No, he was not. Yeah, okay, well, we'll get going here. Our primary sources of information about him. Well, thankfully, the Germans do keep good records. So we have lots of official documents and correspondence from his chancellery. He had secretaries, and there are copies of his letters, his decrees and administrative records, down to we have some accounts of people who traveled with him that kept track of the bills and how much they paid for what. Some of it's actually in the United States. The University of Pittsburgh has some, and Emory University has some records. I don't know how they got there. But yeah, the Saxon State Archives are in Dresden and Weimar, and that's where the bulk of his papers are. And they survived both world wars. There are some court and diplomatic records. These would be from the Holy Roman Empire and the imperial records. Those are sometimes a little harder and spottier because they were kept in various places. There was no single capital of the Holy Roman Empire, so it was sort of wherever the emperor happened to be. When it was the Habsburgs, they spent their home base was Vienna, but they were not always there. In fact, probably less than half the year were they in residence there. We have accounts from contemporaries. His secretary and chaplain, Georg Spalatin, did a remembrance of him and obviously was very closely involved with him for probably about 20 years and had been to the University of Erfurt. He actually graduated a year after Luther, so he was just behind Luther. There's no evidence that they met at Erfurt. I really like to believe they did, but we don't have any evidence of that. The Luther movie actually hints that they knew each other from university days. We don't know that. They met probably in Wittenberg. Spalatin was hired first as a tutor for Frederick's children. And he went from being a tutor to being sent on some diplomatic missions and then being asked to assist in drafting some correspondence and decree. And eventually he moved from being tutor to being his secretary and his chaplain, and probably his closest advisor. So Spalatin was also very close friends with Martin Luther. Martin Luther, his letters and writings frequently reference Frederick because Frederick was his boss. Frederick was the prince, the patron of the university where he was employed, and then later on, the man who kept him from being executed as a heretic. And we'll talk about how he did that. There are portraits and even coins and medals that we can use to keep some track of him because Saxony actually minted coins during this period. Secondary sources. Yeah, we're kind of thin on the ground there. There is, I mentioned only two in the last 100 years. 1984, Ingetraut Ludolfi, who actually was based in what was then East Germany, before the wall came down, before the reunification. And she wrote a very extremely detailed documented biography of him and managed to get it printed, managed to get the manuscript out of East Germany into West Germany, because Göttingen is in West Germany. And then it was reprinted in 2006 in Leipzig. And everybody says she's the best source for everything. The book that I relied on mostly is the one by Sam Wellman from 2015, and it's the only other one published. I've got a copy of the German, because Ludolfi's is written in German and hasn't been translated, but I've got a copy on the way. It's out of print, sadly, but I managed to snag one. Other than that, well, any account of the Reformation that you find, and I've just listed, probably four of the most important biographers of Luther or general historical accounts of the Reformation. Leopold von Ranke, of course, who's a famous German historian, wrote an account of the Reformation in 1905. Martin Brecht and Lohse and Obermann all wrote in the 1980s, which was there was a little mini renaissance of Luther studies, largely because he was born in 1483. So the 1980s being the 500th anniversary of his birth, I think these guys managed to persuade publishers that there would be some market for biographies of Luther. But if you want to read a biography of Luther, those are three of the best. And they, of course, all tell parts of the story of Frederick, because he figures the Obermann, which I brought my copy of the Obermann over there, the Obermann has like 25 entries in the index. So it's a biography of Luther, but the index says, well, I got 25 entries on Frederick. So you can actually pick up quite a bit, but it's not complete. So one of the things that intrigues me about him is there are just not that many political leaders in the history of Europe who get the little sobriquet of the wise. There's lots of greats, not so many wises. I actually was able to find 10. There's one king of France who's known as the wise, Charles V. There is one king of Spain who's known as the wise, Alfonso X is. There's one Byzantine emperor in Constantinople who gets that little suffix. And then there's a king of Navarre, a king of Naples, and a king of Hungary, one each, different time periods. It's interesting, no one nationality seems to have a monopoly on wise rulers. They're, I think, relatively rare. Everybody only gets one. There's a Duke of Austria, a Duke of Bavaria, a Grand Prince of Kiev, or Kiev, and Frederick. And interestingly, Saxony eventually became a kingdom. It was a kingdom from around 1800 until just after World War I. And I'll talk about some connections. Saxony has a really checkered, the genealogical charts get crazy. We'll talk about that. In fact, working on this lecture, I very quickly realized that this was going to actually illustrate one of my favorite sayings to all of my history students over the years, which is that you cannot understand history, any historical period, any historical figure, without getting the background right. And the background in two areas. One is geography, and the other is genealogy. If you don't understand the geography of a person's life, and you don't understand the genealogy, who were their parents, who were their grandparents, who did they marry, how many children do they have, you won't understand them. If you don't do those things first, you'll understand. So, for good or for ill, personally, I think it's for good. But for good or for ill, I'm going to spend some time on Frederick, first of all, laying the groundwork in the geography of Saxony, where it is, and what was around it, and the genealogy of Frederick, because the genealogy plays a huge role in his lifetime and the political fortunes of the territory that he was the ruler of. And he was, to do a 21st century phrase, he was kind of a big deal. We don't really notice that so much anymore because he's not in anybody's list of kings or emperors or great conquerors, but in the 1400s and the 1500s, he was kind of a big deal. And now he's only mentioned because he was connected to Luther. But even if there had never been a Martin Luther, he would still be a big deal over the course of his life. So, here's the simplified geography of the Holy Roman Empire. You still with me? Yeah, this is 1356. This is what all of the German nobility and the German emperors had to deal with. It's actually, believe it or not, more complicated than Italian geography and politics. Italy, the classic Renaissance text will tell you there are 5 major powers. Italy wasn't unified as a country until the 1870s. There are 5 major city-states. The empire is more like 150 major ones, and another 150 little itty-bitty city-states. So there's imperial chartered cities that don't owe any allegiance or pay any taxes to any local nobleman. They're chartered directly from the emperor. There are about 100 of those. They played a key role in the Reformation. They were the first ones to convert to Luther's cause, the imperial cities, with their charters directly from the emperor. And the emperor was absolutely furious because he didn't want anybody to conform to, but the cities had a degree of independence. But all these little city-states are constantly in conflict and struggle and occasional outright warfare with each other, as you can imagine. And the reason this is set in 1356 is because that's the year there was a decree by the emperor to settle the question of how do we pick the next emperor. So the office of emperor in Germany through the Middle Ages was never strictly hereditary. It was always a matter of election and affirmation by the leading members of the nobility. And the small states, the insignificant nobles, and the city, nobody's going to listen to the cities, had more or less to say and to do with it. It's usually the great nobles, the ones who controlled the most territory and had the most power. So finally, they settle this in 1356, and they basically say, okay, we're going to limit the people who get to choose the emperor to a total of 7. There will be 7 electors. And when the emperor dies, those 7 must assemble within a certain number of months, usually only 3 or 4. They must all go to Frankfurt. Every year, that's where the elections are held. Not every year, but every succession. And they will vote. And whoever they select will get the title of King of the Romans first, oddly enough. Voltaire quips later in the 1700s that the Holy Roman Empire is 3 lies and 3 words, because it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But the first title given to someone who wins the election amongst the 7 electors, and it's nice that it's an odd number because it only takes 4, gets the title King of the Romans, and then he is supposed to be actually given his imperial investiture with the imperial crown and title in Rome. And so all through the Middle Ages, the person selected to lead this hodgepodge of nobles goes to Aachen, which had been Charlemagne's capital, and is given the title King of the Romans. And then he travels across the Alps down into Italy, and he goes to Rome, and he is given the title Emperor by the Pope, because Charlemagne was the first one to get that. And the empire, you see these red boundary lines, the empire includes territory on both sides of the Alps. Northern Italy is part of the Holy Roman Empire. And continued to be until those cities got rich enough, built their own walls, raised their own armies, and said, no, we're not paying taxes anymore. Come try and make us. And a succession of emperors brought armies down, and for a while was able to make them, and then after a while was not able to make them anymore, and they achieved independence. But northern Italy has always had a different flavor from the rest of the peninsula because it was tied in to this larger political structure all through the Middle Ages. Here are the major noble houses in the Upper Lap. I'm not even going to go through all those, although you do see free imperial cities. Oh, the Swiss cantons. The Swiss are a completely different case. They have mountains, and they're very fierce, and nobody wants to mess with them after a while. So they get their independence. Ecclesiastical territories, there are bishoprics and archbishoprics that amount to independent territories. The ruler of certain territories is a bishop or an archbishop. They collect the taxes, they hire the soldiers, they appoint administrators. And so in the end, in this settlement of 1356, 3 of the 7 electors are archbishops because they control vast territory, have vast resources, vast influence. They have their own armies, their own militias. When the emperor goes to war, he has to summon the noblemen and ask each of them, yeah, bring your guys, we're going to war. The emperor doesn't really have an army of his own. Now, that's one reason why the Habsburg family eventually comes to dominate, because the Habsburg family, they're not always elected, but the Duchy of Austria is wealthy enough that in their own name, as the Duke of Austria, they control their own small army. It's not the emperor's army, it's the army of the Duke of Austria. And interestingly, these territories here along the eastern border are all sort of frontier marches. They had been settled by conquest and colonization. The German name for Austria, by the way, is the Eastern Kingdom. Österreich is still the actual name of Austria. Okay, so we can simplify this just a little bit. The 7 electors: the Archbishop of Trier, the Archbishop of Cologne, King of Bohemia, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, the Duke of Saxony-Wittenberg, the Margrave of Brandenburg, and the Archbishop of Mainz. So you see 3 archbishops, and a king, and a duke, and a margrave, and a count. And that doesn't really mean what. Here you go, they're referencing the 1356 Golden Bull, which established all of this. Here's really what we're looking at. Here's the simplified version of that crazy map that I started with. Here are the 3 archbishops: Cologne, Trier, and Mainz, although they have kind of a checkerboard collection of territory where they rule and have authority. And the pieces where they rule and have authority and collect taxes, they're not connected to each other always. They're surrounded by neighboring authorities. And as you can imagine, life gets very complicated very quickly. The 4 secular electors are all over on the eastern side of the empire. So the Margrave of Brandenburg, with his residence in Berlin, and now you understand something about German history for the next 700 years. So the Margrave of Brandenburg, that will eventually become Prussia, which will eventually become Germany. The Duke of Saxony, I told you he's kind of a big deal. The King of Bohemia, and the Count Palatine of the Rhine. So he has a residence over here at Heidelberg, but he also has territory over here right up against the border of Bohemia. So there's 7 electors. Whoever rules any of these 7 territories has a great deal of power. And when there's a vacancy, if an emperor dies, these 7 assemble in Frankfurt and they vote on who the next emperor will be. So if you're the elector of Saxony, you are a player. And you might actually be considered a candidate to succeed as emperor. Because very often, if the Habsburgs don't dominate everything, as they eventually do, but in the earlier period, they don't always, the archbishops aren't going to be elected as emperors. But the Margrave of Brandenburg could be elected. The Duke of Saxony could be elected. The King of Bohemia could be elected. The Count Palatine, I keep wanting to give you the Latin, Palatinate, the Count Palatine of the Rhine, or any other nobleman. And occasionally, even foreign nobility are considered to be in the running. Occasionally, people nominate the King of France because he's paying bribes to 2 or 3. He can never quite get 4 votes, but sometimes he gets 3. And, he has aspirations. Because if he could be King of France and Holy Roman Emperor, I mean, that would be something. Doesn't quite pull it off. But you understand more about German politics when you understand that that was at various times theoretically a possibility. So now we need to talk about genealogy. Now that you've got a little geography in your head, a little. So here is Frederick the Wise's grandfather, Frederick II. He marries Margaret of Austria, who is the sister of the emperor. She's a Habsburg, and her brother is the emperor. So I told you, the Elector of Saxony is kind of a big deal. He has 2 sons. And unfortunately, the Germans, this is not unique to Saxony. This is a widespread problem throughout the empire. The Germans never solved the problem of inheritance the way the English do. The English very early in the Middle Ages adopt primogeniture, which is the title and the land go to the eldest son. The younger son has to find some other way to make his way through life. we're not breaking up the title and the land. The Germans don't seem to have ever quite figured that out. So Frederick, the grandfather, in his great wisdom, takes his two sons, Ernest and Albert, and says, you guys rule jointly. Now, anybody who has children, especially anybody who has two sons who are close in age, can probably predict how that worked out because they're only 2 years apart. Ernest is 2 years older than Albert. And for a while, they ruled jointly. Now, Papa did actually say, yeah, Ernest gets to cast the vote. If there's an imperial election, Ernest gets to cast the vote. Everything else, they ruled jointly. And of course, eventually the two brothers are like this with each other. So Ernest has finally had enough. After 20 years of rule, Ernest has had enough. And he says, tell you what, I'm going to draw up a map. I'm going to divide Saxony into two pieces. I'm going to make the proposal. I'm going to put the maps down on the table. You pick which one you want. Right? You ever done that with birthday cake? I'm going to cut two pieces. You pick the piece you want. I mean, it's an age-old principle. So they divide Saxony into two pieces. Yeah, after Papa dies. So now we have what's called Ernestine Saxony and Albertine Saxony, or we have electoral Saxony and ducal Saxony. And they actually don't go to war, surprisingly, because Ernst, the older brother, was fairly clever in the way he drew things. But when Ernst dies, our guy Frederick inherits his half of Saxony and the electoral title. So he is Duke of Saxony and the Elector of Saxony, 1463 to 1525. And there are his siblings, by the way. We'll come back to him. His older sister became Queen of Denmark. His younger brother Ernest became Archbishop of Magdeburg and Bishop of Halberstadt. That's not canonically legal, but if you pay the Pope, you can be bishop of two places at once. He has another brother who was on the path to being Archbishop of Mainz, which would have given them 2 votes out of 7. They would have been really powerful. Unfortunately, he died at 17. He was in the hierarchy and in the line to eventually ascend to that. And then his next younger brother is John, the Steadfast. And you got to wonder what Frederick thought about those. So he's got a sister who's off in Denmark. He's got a brother who's an ordained bishop, so he's got a career. Another brother died young. He's got another sister who married a duke, became a duchess of a smaller principality, Brunswick-Lüneburg. But he's got this younger brother, John. He's like, gosh, I hope history does not repeat itself. And we'll see. Actually, you can read the title there. But if we go back to this title, this larger map here, the 7 electors, here's what Saxony looks like. You remember, Ernest, Frederick's father, drew the map and then said to his younger brother, now you pick which piece you want. So there's a middle piece in red that's actually connected from north to south. And there's some trade routes there. Wittenberg is actually at the time not much more than about 500 people living on a sandbar. But the northern part here and part of his southern part are where the silver mines are. So he's got one piece here, it's got the silver mine, a not insignificant source of income. The other part has the cities. So Dresden and Leipzig. He basically says to his younger brother, okay, You want the big cities or you want the silver mines? You pick. And his brother Albert says, I'll take the cities. So Ernest says, okay, fine. I got the silver mines, which means that Frederick, when he succeeds to the title, now his father dies, his uncle is still ruling the part in yellow. And thereby hangs an incredible tale, as you might imagine. Most of this book over here is taken up with the jousting and the dueling and the maneuvering between the two, and disputes over where the borders are. And part of the agreement actually was that Ernest and then Frederick were supposed to share a percentage of the silver mine profits with the other half of the territory, and there were always disputes in the accounting over what the proper royalty was supposed to be. Yeah, it could go on and on and on. But one of the reasons for the rise of Wittenberg is because there's no other city in the territory. There's some hunting lodges, and there's some other interesting establishments. By the way, this territory runs all the way over here to Eisenach and Gotha. Just outside Eisenach, there's a very famous castle that's part of Saxony, the Wartburg. We've been there. So the Wartburg Castle was right over here outside Eisenach. There's Gotha. Looking for some of the other places. Oh, here's Weimar. Weimar is in electoral Saxony. It's the largest city he's actually got. Kolditz, Torgau. He has a hunting lodge near Torgau. He has the River Elbe, which Wittenberg is on that river, and that's an important travel route and trade route. So, yeah, it's a bit of a mess. It really is a beautiful exemplar of why not practicing primogeniture is really not a good idea. This is a mess for generations. So yeah, there we go. The big cities, Leipzig and Dresden. They're larger cities. They're bishoprics. Leipzig has the only university in Saxony. And it's one of the older universities in Germany. Chartered by the emperor and chartered by the pope. The red part, Frederick's part, doesn't have a university. And we're going to see that play out. So he does start building a castle, building walls around the city of Wittenberg. It really is just a little village on a sandbar on one bank of the Elbe. You can go there now, and you can walk from one end of it to the other in 10 minutes. It's a little itty-bitty town. But there's at one end a huge castle, a residence for the Elector of Saxony, and it became one of Frederick's favorite residences. And as part of that residence, there's a large church, which he had built. At the other end of the main street that runs along the sandbar on the bank of the Elbe, there is an Augustinian monastery right inside the gate of the city at the other end of the one main. It's a one-horse, one-street town. It's like one stoplight. Frederick got a very interesting education. His father was determined that his children would be well educated. His father had apparently been embarrassed at a couple of trips that he made with the previous emperor when he could not understand conversations being conducted in Latin or occasionally being conducted in French, both of which were spoken in parts of the empire. Latin, of course, is the language of the church and the language of the courts, the language that the laws are in when you want to look up a legal principle. So Ernest is like, my kids are going to be better educated than I was. So Ernest's grandmother, Margaret, sister to Emperor Frederick, and Margaret, his grandmother, is in residence with his mother. She's the daughter of the Duke of Bavaria. And these two women took over the education of the children. And I showed you, the two daughters and the four sons, they have their own little school. And yeah, his mother and grandmother oversaw the education of Frederick and his brothers. His father gave written instructions. We have a letter in the chancery where his father says that his sons are to be taught Latin and French, as well as the other subjects necessary for a sovereign. So Frederick grows up trilingual. He winds up traveling with the emperor. He can speak, he can write letters, he can understand Latin, he can speak, he can write French, and of course he speaks and writes German. He's fairly unique for a nobleman in this period. Most noblemen did not get that level of education. Now, he did not attend university, but he had private tutors in all these subjects. Yeah, there we go, fluent in 3 languages, at least. He had read the classics. He had his own favorite Latin authors. We know because he quotes them in his letters. Terence, he loved. He enjoyed music. He played the lute. And he delighted in hunting and in jousting at tournaments. Again, we see this picture of him, and we think, yeah, okay, this is like Henry VIII. He's not getting on a horse, the horse will collapse. But we miss the fact that he didn't always look like that. As a young man, he delighted in going out in the woods and hunting. So let's talk about his life. Born in 1463 in Torgau, which means he's exactly 20 years older than Luther. Luther was born in 1483. The division of Saxony, the split that his father and his uncle pulled off, happened when he was only 2 years old. When he was, not 2 years old, 22 years old. Yeah, so the 2 brothers ruled together for 20 years, and then they divided the territory. A year after the division, his father died, and he became Elector of Saxony, Landgrave of Thuringia. That part of that red map that I showed you was actually the province of Thuringia. The Wartburg Castle had been the old residence of the Thuringian noblemen. They had been absorbed into Saxony. So 23, he's now the master of at least his half. And at 30, he decides he's going to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And so he travels over the Alps to Venice. He and his uncle, the Duke of Bavaria, because his mother had been married. His mother was the sister of the Duke of Bavaria, so this is his uncle, Uncle Duke. They go to Venice. They charter a ship. It's probably a party of about 40 or 50. They sail the Mediterranean all the way to the Holy Land. They disembark. They've taken disguises. They're not giving out their real names because that would just invite people to come rob them. And he travels to Jerusalem, and he visits the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. He visits the birthplace of Jesus in Bethlehem. There's a church there as well. He visits the Sea of Galilee. And he's actually gone from March to October. It's about an 8-week journey there and about an 8-week journey back. So 7 months he's gone. And while he's gone, he had named his younger brother John as regent to rule his half of Saxony. And John actually, over the course of his life, earns his own nickname. He is John the Steadfast, or John the True, John the Loyal, because for his entire life, he remained sort of the right-hand man. They were not ruling jointly because I think somebody had figured out that was a bad idea, but he became sort of the second in command to his older brother. And represented him well. In 1496, while he's on that pilgrimage, the emperor died. And there's a new emperor elected, and of course, he gets to cast the vote, and it's a Habsburg. It's one of his grandmother's relatives, Maximilian. The Germans affectionately call him Kaiser Max. And he was a little bit older than Frederick. They're cousins. Some accounts I've read identify him as sort of having an uncle-nephew relationship with Frederick. Frederick, at that election, is 33 and is now well-educated, well-traveled, and by all accounts was an excellent administrator. And one of the things that Kaiser Max does, because of course he had gotten Frederick's vote, was appointed him as president of the Imperial Governing Council, which means that when the emperor is out of the empire or when he's off on military campaign in Italy, Frederick is the one with the power to make decisions. He can issue decrees and put the seal of the emperor on a decree because he's the president of the Imperial Council. And that's at 37. He's arguably the second most powerful nobleman in the Holy Roman Empire and the confidant of the emperor, the supporter of the emperor. Now, his uncle is still ruling ducal Saxony, and his uncle has actually gone to war with the emperor. So the two of them are kind of rivals for imperial favor and attention. Albert is now one of the generals for the emperor, and Frederick is one of the political appointees of the emperor. And Kaiser Max, Habsburg from Austria, from Vienna, the family that had always hoped for more power to centralize the administration of all the territories of Germany and make them more uniform and more answerable and to derive tax revenue from all of it. And of course, the princes and the noblemen always pushed back and always fought those efforts. And Frederick, on the Imperial Council and as an elector, kind of joined with the nobles and said to the emperor, let's not move too hastily to establish any more of these central authorities. They fought over whether there was going to be a central court to administer legal cases from the whole empire. And of course, Maximilian's in favor of that. The English king and the French king have learned how to use royal courts to their advantage to increase their power. And Frederick and the other noblemen are kind of not interested in giving Max that power. So there's tension. They remained friendly personally, but they have differing political views, differing political goals. 1502, he says, okay, I didn't get the cities. I didn't get Dresden and Leipzig, but I got the silver mines, and I can found a university. And so he founds a university in the little city that he's chosen for his residence, where he's building a castle, and he's built a big Gothic church. He says, I want a university. And it starts out remarkably successful. The first year they are conducting classes, they have 400 students, which doesn't seem huge by our standards, but by late medieval standards, it is. It's significant. It doesn't rival Paris or Oxford or Bologna, which have several thousand students each, but there are no medieval universities that are like the mega universities in the US. There are no medieval universities with 30 and 40,000 students. If you have 1,000 students, you got a big university by medieval standards. So starting off the first year with 400 is pretty astonishing. Sadly, in years 2 and 3, there was an outbreak of the plague in Wittenberg, and enrollment plummeted, dropped all the way down to about 100, and no more than about 10 professors. His close assistant, cooperator in the founding university was Johannes Staupitz. And Staupitz is a really interesting figure. I could do a whole lecture about him. Staupitz was very well educated, university degree, had a doctorate. He was a scholar on the languages of classical Latin and beginning to dabble in Greek. That was starting to be the hot new thing. He was also, rather interestingly, the head of the Augustinian order in the empire. And he was, in addition to being the head of all the Augustinian monasteries throughout the empire, his residence was in Erfurt, where there was a university. And when a young law student dropped out of the University of Erfurt and went and presented himself at the door to the Augustinian monastery, his confessor, his father confessor, was Staupitz. So Luther becomes Staupitz's protege. Staupitz says, okay, I've got a university degree. I've helped found this university. I've been lecturing for a couple of years, but I've got so many other duties and responsibilities. I can't keep doing everything. I need to train up somebody to take my place at the university in Wittenberg. And I think this young monk who dropped out of law school, who's clearly brilliant, should be the one who eventually replaces me. And so for 6 or 7 years, Luther is Staupitz's protege. Staupitz sends him back to the University of Erfurt to get a doctorate in theology. He had an undergraduate degree. He was a magister. He had started his legal studies and then dropped out. Staupitz sends him back and says, go back, get a doctorate. And I have a place for you. I have a plan. (1508), Martin Luther arrives in Wittenberg. The university is only 6 years old. He takes Staupitz's place. He's one of 2 professors in the theology department. One of 2 professors teaching Bible. Professor of theology. And with the blessing of Staupitz says, oh, by the way, what you need is more work. So I'm also going to make you prior of the monastery. I'm also going to make you supervisor of all the Augustinian monasteries in Saxony. And the town actually needs a preacher in the town church for the townspeople. So I want you to take on that and preach every Sunday to the townspeople. And Luther kind of just thrives and discharges all of those responsibilities incredibly successfully. He's clearly brilliant and needs these activities to keep him focused and from falling into depression. He needs stuff to do, and Staupitz knew that. So he's been teaching at the University of Wittenberg for about 9 years, and he's not exactly famous, but he has a very good reputation in Saxony, obviously, because there are only 2 universities in all of Saxony. There's the university in Albertine, Saxony, in Leipzig, and that's an older one. That's 150 years old. There's the University of Wittenberg, which is the brand new university, and he's kind of like their star. There are only about a dozen professors still, but he's obviously the most brilliant of them. And in 1517, he gets a little out of sorts over the sale of indulgences, which is a crude transaction to raise money for the building of a new church in Rome. As soon as the money clinks in the chest, the soul springs to its rest, and other absurdities. And it's interesting that Frederick would not allow the sale of indulgences in his part of Saxony, but his uncle Albert was letting them be sold in his part of Saxony. And you remember what the map looks like. If you're letting them be sold in one part of Saxony, everybody in Saxony is going to know about it. It's a real simple matter. It's like, 3 hours walk and you're into a territory where you can buy an indulgence. And so people from Wittenberg are doing the 3-hour walk and they're coming back and saying, look what I got. There's a great scene in the movie where a young woman comes back and says, Dr. Luther, look what I got. And Luther goes, oh no. He says, something must be said, something shall be said. And so he posts the 95 Theses saying, this is terrible. I can't believe the Pope even knows what they're doing and saying in his name. He sends a copy to the Archbishop of Mainz and a copy to the Pope in Rome. He says, because I'm sure if you knew what was going on, you'd stop it. You'd forbid them from doing this anymore because they're saying just crazy things. Back to Frederick. Frederick is the imperial vicar to the emperor. Frederick is the emperor's bud. And now he's got this little upstart professor. So you can see why Frederick is important. And the role that he's going to play is starting to unfold in front of us here. 1519, Kaiser Max dies. January. There's going to be a new election. The 7 electors are going to go to Frankfurt, and they're going to pick a new emperor. And it's going to be Kaiser Max's grandson, who's been growing up in Burgundy, which is part of the Habsburg family estates. He doesn't speak German. He speaks French and Latin and Spanish, because his mother is Spanish. And he will eventually be elected emperor. He's 21 years old. But one of the votes to elect him, he's elected unanimously. The Pope actually dangled in front of Frederick the idea, well, if you play your cards right, if you could just get this little professor of yours to shut up, we could maneuver the archbishops into voting for you. You could vote for yourself. You could be emperor. And Frederick's like, I don't want to be emperor. And certainly not that way.
So he really was wise after all.
In a number of ways. In a number of ways, yeah. So after 1519, after the election of the new emperor, Pope Leo the 10th, whose given name is de Medici. He's one of the Medici popes. He is a grandson of Lorenzo the Magnificent from Florence. And the reason he's building a church in Rome, he wants to build a new church in Rome, is because the Florentines had the unmitigated gall with all of their wealth, because they were like the financial capital of the world, to build a church in Florence that was bigger than St. Peter's in Rome. And so the Medici Pope says, well, we can't have that. I mean, I like the church in Florence, my hometown, but really, think about it. The Church of St. Peter in Rome ought to be the biggest church in Christendom. This means we have to tear the old one down and build a new one, which costs a lot of money. So go out and start selling indulgences, folks, because we need the money. And when Luther starts threatening, because Luther has an immediate impact, there is this new medium of information exchange that has been invented in the mid-1400s, the printing press. Luther's 95 Theses get taken off the bulletin board, and the printer says, I can set this up on one page. And then I can sell each page for a penny, and I can sell thousands, and a penny is a day's wage. So, as the 21st century saying goes, they went viral immediately because one of them, a copy gets carried to another imperial city, which, as I've mentioned, are famously independent. There's printing presses in every one of the 100 imperial cities. They get a copy, they go, I could print these and make money. And so, because there's no copyright. So they print them, they sell them for a penny a piece, they're making money, they get distributed. Other printers go, hey, I could print these and make money. And so the Pope issues a papal bull. Has nothing to do with a four-legged animal. A papal bull is called the seal, the wax seal with the stamp that goes on the end of the thing is called a bulla. So a bulla is a proclamation by the Pope to which he has affixed his seal. And the bulla is named usually from the first couple of words in Latin of what the papal decree is actually calling on. And the first two words of the papal bull of 1520 are Exsurge Domine, which is arise, O Lord, because there is a mad boar who is tearing up and ravaging your vineyards of the church. It's like, we got to do something about Luther. It's actually an order to the German nobility to arrest the heretic Martin Luther and send him to Rome. Arise, O Lord, and defend your church. There's a wild boar ravaging your vineyard. And Frederick's like, nah. I mean, he's wise. He's not really openly defiant. He doesn't write a counterblast and say, I'm not doing that. He's just like, what bull? I haven't gotten an official copy. And I can't tell from the writing. My secretaries have looked at it, and they tell me there's not really anything specific that it instructs me to do. So I don't know. He's good at playing dumb. He's wise. Sometimes some of his opponents and critics call him a sly fox, which I think he thought was a huge compliment. So he just says, no, I'm not doing that. Furthermore, when the Diet of Worms confirms the election of the new emperor, Frederick goes to the new emperor, this 21-year-old brand new naive kid, and says, your grandfather, Kaiser Max, by the way, I was his favorite. He promised us that no German would ever be tried anywhere but in a German court. So if we really have to try Luther on a charge of heresy, we shouldn't be sending him to Rome. Your grandfather, Kaiser Max of blessed memory, would never agree to send a German professor to Rome. Rome doesn't do trials, Rome does executions. So if we're going to do a trial of a German professor as a heretic, it must be done in Germany. And the new Emperor Charles says, oh, well, okay, that was my grandfather, that's the way my grandfather, oh, well, okay, we'll do a trial in Germany. And Frederick is very cleverly protected Luther, and then he tells the emperor, and you know, it's really going to be dangerous for Professor Luther to come from Wittenberg all the way to the city where the Reichstag is going to meet, the Imperial Diet. So you really have an obligation to issue a safe conduct that protects him from being arrested or molested along the way by anybody. Because as Elector of Saxony, I can protect him in my territory, but he's got to pass through the territory of a number of other noblemen. So we need an imperial guarantee of safe conduct. And Charles, you know, consults with his secretaries, the older people, and he's like, this is the new kid. He says, okay. And he signs a safe conduct. And Frederick has, again, very cleverly, very wisely set things up where Luther, even if he winds up being condemned as a heretic at the meeting, he can't be arrested. He has to be allowed to go back to Wittenberg. Well, he is, of course, condemned as a heretic. The Pope is sent a representative, and they're not having a trial with evidence and arguments back and forth. They just lay Luther's books out, which Luther is keeping 4 printing presses busy. He can write faster than they can set type. And he's done a whole bunch of essays. And they lay out Luther's books and essays on the table, and they say, are these your books? And he goes, yes, they're all my books. This is, do you renounce them? They contain heresy. And Luther goes, what's the heresy? And they go, no, we're not here. The Pope has decreed that these books are heretical. Do you renounce them or no? If you don't renounce them, you're condemned as a heretic. So do you renounce them? Luther says, it's neither safe nor right to go against reason and conscience. Show me, using plain reason and the Word of God, where I've done something heretical or said something heretical, written something heretical, and I'll throw my books into the fire. But unless I'm convinced by Scripture and plain reason, no, I'm not going to renounce my books. And the imperial legate, no. The imperial legate turns to the young 21-year-old emperor and says, he's condemned himself. And he's condemned as a heretic. But he's got a safe conduct. But he's condemned as a heretic. And being condemned as a heretic means once the safe conduct is lifted, and it will be once he gets back to Wittenberg, he can be arrested by almost anybody. Frederick may be able to protect him, but you saw how convoluted Saxony was. The other Saxon branch is quite traditional Roman Catholic, loyal to the Pope. They would love to get their hands on Luther for a couple of reasons, but it would embarrass the other half of the Saxon tribe. And so on the way home from Worms, Luther is suddenly confronted with a group of horsemen. About a dozen horsemen suddenly come out of the forest, surround him, ask, are you Martin Luther? And he says, yes. And they put a canvas bag over his head and ride off into the forest. And nobody knows what's happened to Martin Luther. All they know is he was on his way home. He was under the protection of the emperor. He had a safe conduct. And a group of a dozen horsemen came out, surrounded us, identified him, put a canvas bag over his head, and put him on a horse and rode off. And we don't know where he is. And nobody hears from him for 3 or 4 months. Frederick had arranged the kidnapping of his own professor and took him to the Wartburg Castle and hid him. So that little castle on the very edge of his territory, very secure up on top of a mountain. And what Luther does in the 3 or 4 months that he's there, he says, bring me my books, bring me my copy of the Greek New Testament that Erasmus has published. And we talked about Erasmus a couple months ago. Bring me my Greek dictionaries. I'm going to translate the Bible into German. I'm going to translate it from Greek, not from Latin. I'm going to translate it from Greek into German such that any German housewife in Saxony can read it and understand it. And in 8 weeks, he translates every book of the New Testament into German, takes the manuscript back to Wittenberg. The printers are like, oh, good, more money. These will sell. They print 3,000 of them, and they sell out in about 6 weeks. And they print again, and they print again, and they print again, and they print. That's just the New Testament. It actually takes 10 years for him to get all the Old Testament done. But he does the New Testament very, very quickly. And Frederick is just kind of, what professor? What printing? What books? The book, by the way, doesn't have any mention of Luther's name in it. The German New Testament, he doesn't claim credit for it when it's published. It's published anonymously. Yeah, anonymously. Everybody knows it's Luther. But officially, nobody does. So over the next 4 years, Frederick quietly continues to support and protect Luther. And the Pope is frustrated, the Emperor is frustrated. They can't touch him because he's back in Saxony, back in Wittenberg. Sadly, May 5th, 1525, Frederick died at his favorite hunting lodge. He was 62. He'd been in ill health for a while. And he had no heir. He had never married. He had a mistress, which, under the preaching of Luther, he eventually became convinced that, and he had actually not been a player in that sense. A lot of the German nobility were. He hadn't had a succession of women. He had had 4 children with her, and he kept them all at court, but very quietly and discreetly. And he eventually acknowledged her as his wife. But it was what they call a morganatic marriage, which means the children had no right to inherit anything. So when he dies, his younger brother, John the Steadfast, becomes the elector. And John the Steadfast dies only 7 years later, and then it passes to his son, John Frederick the Magnanimous, who is elector of Saxony for the next 22 years. Sadly, there's a civil war. After Luther's death, the emperor attacks the Protestant princes and defeats them. The Protestant princes are led by John Frederick of Saxony and Philip of Hesse, and they lose the battle. Both of them are taken prisoner. And as a part of the negotiation, because as a heretic, he could have been executed. Both of them could have been executed. John Frederick is forced to give the electoral rights back to the other line. So Uncle Albert and Uncle Albert's descendants now have the elector's vote, and Ducal Saxony no longer exists. He actually is sentenced to life in prison, but is freed in about 5 years and comes back to Saxony, lives to 1554. Yeah, they're the descendants. So we have, here's Frederick the Wise, Duke of Saxony, protector of Martin Luther. And then we have Duke of Saxony Weimar, Duke of Saxe-Coburg, Duke of Saxe-Altenburg, Duke of Saxe-Weimar. Here's my favorite. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 brothers. Duke of Saxe-Gotha, Duke of Saxe-Coburg, Duke of Saxe-Meiningen, Duke of Saxe-Rumkild, Duke of Saxe-Eisenberg, Duke of Saxe-Hildburghausen, and Duke of Saxe-Saalfeld. Yeah, they never quite figured out this thing. But interestingly enough, if you go a little further down here, the descendants of the Duke of Saxe-Coburg, one of them winds up marrying Queen Victoria of England. So her children are all actually in the line of the Dukes of Saxony. All right. Well, I'm over my time limit, but Frederick's reputation remained very high to the end. Luther thought very well of him and wrote very well of him. Even later historians, von Ranke really celebrates Kaiser Max. Von Ranke is one of the great German historians of the late 1700s, early 1800s. So because he celebrates Kaiser Max and wants to elevate his reputation, he kind of wants to diminish Frederick, because Frederick had opposed him and prevented him from accomplishing certain things. 21st century, you got 3 camps. Frederick, the sly, secretive usurper of imperial and ecclesiastical power. And I love this author. He says, yeah, sly, usurper. of ecclesiastical and imperial power, as if ecclesiastical and imperial power had any more legitimacy than ducal power. No. Frederick, the implacable foe of the Emperor Maximilian, Frederick, the Christian prince. Yeah, and Brecht and Ludolfi are my go-tos there if you want to read them. Actually, let me just finish with this because I'm done. I'll read you Ludolfi's, who's that great historian, still in German, but Wellman relies heavily on her. Here we go. The assessment of Ingetraut Ludolfi, Frederick's most thorough biographer. Two great inhibitions denied Frederick an aggressive territorial expansion. He did not like to use force. And from day one, he spent all his money and energies trying to make a respectable electorate out of the shambles he had inherited from the Leipzig division. He kept pace with improvements in government of other territories, but he was not himself an innovator. As an imperial prince, he had enormous influence. By 1500, he opposed strengthening the emperor. Frederick was definitely no champion of enlightened imperial reform. It is as a Christian prince that Frederick stands above all the others of his time. From a sense of justice and Christian duty, he risked his electorate to protect the truth he thought Martin Luther revealed in the Holy Scriptures, which I think is a completely logical and sound basis to call him Frederick the Wise. So I hope that gave you a better picture of this time period and a better picture of where Luther fits into his culture and the politics, the geography of the empire, and the confusion that was Saxony. I confess, when I started on this, I'm going, wait, what? Why are there two Saxonies? As it turns out, that was important, an important detail. All right, so next month, I'm going to go back into Germany, and I'm going to talk about another Frederick. This is not Frederick the Wise. This is Frederick the Great. So I talked about Brandenburg as one of the 7 electors. Frederick the Great is the ruler of Brandenburg, and he's one of the founders of the modern state of Prussia. And he's a flute-playing philosopher. He invites Johann Sebastian Bach to his court and plays a tune on the flute and asks Bach to improvise on it. So he's a really interesting figure, and we'll talk about why he is Frederick the Great.
All right.
Thank you.
So what happened to Luther after Frederick died?
John the Steadfast was absolutely convinced that Luther was the true proclaimer of the truth of the gospel. And so John the Steadfast, the younger brother of Frederick the Wise, protected Luther and actually did more to support the spread of Lutheran ideas and the reform of the churches in Saxony. In fact, the emperor, or the elector Frederick, never really wanted to change the worship services and the decorations, and he didn't really want to do a complete change from the old patterns of church worship. John the Steadfast immediately said, okay, Professor Luther, what should we do? Luther said, well, I would recommend this, this, and this, and I have 5 or 6 students who've just graduated from the university that I've trained, and if you would put them in as preachers in the most important towns, then we'd go a long way very quickly. And John the Steadfast does all of it. And his son, Johann Frederick, is as every bit as enthusiastic as his father. I mean, he and the Landgrave of Hesse become the 2 leading organizers of the League of Protestant Princes. And sadly, when they finally do get into a war with the emperor, they lose. They're defeated in battle disastrously. They're both taken prisoner. So it kind of crushes the Protestant movement for a generation in the empire. But yeah, that's Luther then is, Luther lives to 1546, and he is still teaching at the university under both John the Steadfast and John Frederick. But they are more enthusiastic.